It began, as so many pivotal moments in this era do, not with a formal address from a hallowed hall of government, but with a burst of characters on a screen. On a day that had the world bracing for the next phase of a seemingly inevitable war, President Donald Trump took to social media to announce the unthinkable. "Congratulations, world, it's time for peace," the message read, a stunning declaration that seemed to defy the escalating military actions of the preceding days. The announcement promised a complete and total ceasefire between two of the Middle East's most bitter rivals, Iran and Israel, set to begin in just 6 hours. For a global audience holding its collective breath, the statement was as jarring as it was unexpected, a sudden pivot from the brink of conflict to the language of reconciliation. The message landed with the force of a geopolitical earthquake, sending shockwaves through newsrooms, financial markets, and the corridors of power from Washington to Tehran and Jerusalem. How could this be? Just hours earlier, the narrative was one of retaliation and counter-retaliation, a dangerous dance of military might that threatened to plunge the region into chaos. The president's tone was not just optimistic, it was declarative, almost triumphant. He framed the ceasefire not as a fragile truce, but as a definitive end to the immediate hostilities. This was vintage Trump, bold, unconventional, and using his direct line to the public to bypass traditional diplomatic channels and frame the narrative on his own terms. The world was left to wonder if this was a masterstroke of diplomacy or a dangerously impulsive gamble. The hours that followed the announcement were a flurry of confusion and cautious optimism. Was the ceasefire real? Had both Iran and Israel actually agreed to this, or was the president simply willing it into existence through a public proclamation? Diplomats scrambled for confirmation, while military analysts tried to decipher the strategic implications. The president's follow-up posts only deepened the intrigue. He thanked Iran for its cooperation, a gesture that would have been unimaginable just a day prior, and suggested that all sides had got it out of their system. It was a surreal moment, watching a conflict that had been brewing for decades seemingly diffused through a handful of social media updates, turning the complex art of international diplomacy into a real-time public spectacle. For people across the Middle East and beyond, the news offered a tentative, almost unbelievable sigh of relief. The spectre of a regional war, with its devastating human and economic costs, had felt terrifyingly close. The sudden halt to the forward momentum of conflict felt like a reprieve, a moment to step back from the abyss. But beneath the relief, a deep sense of uncertainty lingered. Was this a genuine turning point, a foundational step toward a more stable future for the region? Or was it merely a temporary pause in a long and intractable struggle, a fleeting calm before an even more violent storm? The world watched, waited, and hoped, all because of a single message typed out and sent to the world. To understand the sudden announcement of peace, you have to look back at the events that pushed the region to the very edge of war just days earlier. The crisis began with a decisive and highly secretive American military operation. Over the weekend, under the cover of darkness, United States forces carried out a series of precision airstrikes against 3 of Iran's most sensitive and heavily fortified nuclear sites. This was not a minor skirmish or a proxy battle. It was a direct and audacious assault on the heart of Iran's nuclear ambitions. The targets were carefully selected to deliver a powerful message that the United States had the capability and the will to dismantle Iran's program if it chose to. The world learned of the strikes not through leaks or rumors, but through an official confirmation from the Pentagon, which immediately put the international community on high alert. The decision to strike was a monumental gamble by the Trump administration. For years, the international community had debated how to handle Iran's nuclear program, with diplomacy often taking center stage. This action represented a dramatic shift in strategy, moving from economic sanctions and negotiations to direct military force. The administration's justification was based on intelligence suggesting that Iran was on the verge of a significant nuclear breakthrough, a development the United States and its ally, Israel, had long vowed to prevent. The strikes were designed to be crippling, targeting key infrastructure at facilities like Fordo, a site buried deep within a mountain and long considered a symbol of Iran's defiance. The message was clear and unambiguous. The red lines would be enforced. The immediate aftermath of the United States strikes was a period of intense and anxious silence. The world waited for Iran's response, knowing that the regime in Tehran could not let such a direct attack on its sovereignty go unanswered. The question was not if Iran would retaliate, but how, when, and where. Would it launch a full-scale assault on United States forces in the region? Would it target American allies like Israel or Saudi Arabia? Or would it unleash its proxy forces across the Middle East, igniting a multi-front conflict that would be impossible to contain? The stakes were astronomically high, and military commands across the globe were on their highest state of alert, preparing for a chain reaction that could spiral out of control at any moment. This act of aggression set the stage for one of the most dangerous and carefully managed standoffs in modern history. The American operation was a calculated risk, intended to re-establish deterrence and force Iran back to the negotiating table from a position of weakness. However, it also pushed the Iranian leadership into a corner, forcing them to choose between a response that could either restore their credibility at home or trigger a devastating war they could not win. The world watched as the two nations stood toe-to-toe, the silence between the initial strike and the inevitable retaliation stretching for what felt like an eternity. The spark had been lit, and the powder keg was ready to explode. The Iranian response, when it came, was as calculated and symbolic as the American strike that provoked it. It was not a wild, indiscriminate lashing out, but a meticulously planned military operation given a grand name: Heralds of Conquest. In a move that demonstrated both its military capability and its strategic thinking, Iran launched 6 ballistic missiles. The target was not a civilian center or an Israeli city, which would have guaranteed a massive escalation. Instead, the missiles were aimed at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, the forward headquarters for United States Central Command, and the nerve center of American military power in the Middle East. The choice of target was deliberate, a direct message to the United States military that its most important assets were within reach. The symbolism of the Iranian operation was layered with meaning. The number of missiles launched, 6, was not arbitrary. It was chosen to precisely match the number of munitions the United States had reportedly used in its strike against the Fordo nuclear facility. This was tit-for-tat retaliation in its most literal form, a signal that Iran was seeking to even the score, not to escalate the conflict into an all-out war. It was a demonstration of resolve intended for both a domestic and an international audience. For the people of Iran, it was proof that their government would not bow to American aggression. For the world, it was a carefully calibrated move designed to save face while deliberately leaving an off-ramp for de-escalation. What made this military retaliation so extraordinary, however, was not the missiles themselves, but the communication that preceded them. In a move that is almost unheard of in modern warfare, Iran provided advance warning of the impending attack. According to reports, both Qatari and United States officials were alerted before the missiles were launched, giving them precious time to take cover and activate defense systems. This wasn't an attack designed to inflict mass casualties, it was a piece of military theatre. Iran needed to show its strength, to satisfy hardliners at home, and to re-establish a sense of deterrence. But it seemingly had no appetite for the catastrophic war that would follow if American soldiers were killed. The warning was a clear signal. We are going to do this, but we don't want anyone to get hurt. This careful choreography turned what could have been an act of war into a complex diplomatic signal. The Operation Heralds of Conquest was less about conquering territory and more about conquering the narrative. Iran demonstrated that it had sophisticated ballistic missiles and the will to use them, yet it also showed a level of restraint that was just as powerful. It was a high-stakes performance on the world stage, where the missiles were the props and the real message was one of de-escalation. Iran was essentially saying, "We have responded. We are even. Now the ball is in your court." This calculated response set the stage for the next, equally surprising move in this geopolitical chess match. The most remarkable outcome of Iran's missile barrage on Al Udeid Air Base was what didn't happen. As the world waited for the casualty reports to trickle in, bracing for the grim news of American losses that would surely trigger a massive United States counterstrike. An incredible announcement came through. There were no casualties. Not a single United States or coalition service member was killed or injured. The Qatari government confirmed that all 6 Iranian missiles had been successfully intercepted by the base's advanced air defense systems. The news was met with a wave of relief in Washington and other world capitals. A disaster of immense proportions, one that seemed all but certain just hours before, had been miraculously averted. This outcome was no accident. It was the direct result of careful planning and back-channel communication that defined this entire episode. Iran's advance warning had been the critical factor. It gave the United States military at Al Udeid the crucial window of time needed to move personnel into hardened shelters and to place air defense systems, like the Patriot missile batteries, on their highest state of alert. The warning allowed the United States to treat the incoming attack not as a surprise assault, but as a predictable event to be managed. This transformed a potentially bloody confrontation into a live-fire drill, a real-world test of the base's defensive capabilities, where the primary goal was the preservation of life. President Trump himself acknowledged the importance of this unprecedented warning. In his social media posts following the incident, he explicitly thanked Iran for its advance notice, stating that it was the reason there had been no loss of life or injuries. This public expression of gratitude to an adversary in the immediate aftermath of an attack was surreal, but it served a crucial diplomatic purpose. It signaled to Iran that its message of calibrated response had been received and understood. It allowed the president to frame the outcome as a victory. American defenses worked perfectly and American lives were protected, without feeling politically pressured by hawks in Washington to launch a devastating counterattack. The lack of casualties provided the perfect off-ramp for both sides. The miracle of no casualties was, in reality, a triumph of carefully managed de-escalation. It demonstrated that even in a direct military exchange between 2 hostile nations, there are unwritten rules of engagement that can be followed to prevent a worst-case scenario. Both sides acted with a degree of restraint that prioritized avoiding a wider war over inflicting maximum damage. Iran showed it could strike a major United States base, and the United States showed it could defend it. With honors seemingly even and, most importantly, no blood spilled on either side, the path was suddenly clear for a de-escalation that would have been impossible had the missiles found their targets and claimed American lives. At the center of this high-stakes drama was a sprawling military installation in the Qatari desert, Al Udeid Air Base. This is not just another overseas outpost. It is, honestly, arguably the most important United States military base in the entire Middle East. Al Udeid serves as the forward headquarters for United States Central Command, or CENTCOM, which is the unified command responsible for all US military operations across a region stretching from Egypt to Pakistan. Housing over 10,000 American troops, a fleet of advanced aircraft, including heavy bombers and aerial refueling tankers, and sophisticated command and control systems, the base is really the logistical backbone and nerve center for American power projection in the region. Its strategic importance just cannot be overstated, which is precisely why Iran chose it as a target. The US military, though, was not caught unprepared. In the weeks leading up to the crisis, as tensions with Iran simmered, satellite imagery revealed a flurry of activity at Al Udeid. Commercial satellite photos from early June showed that the US Air Force had already taken significant precautionary measures. Aircraft, which would normally be parked in neat rows on the tarmac, had been evacuated or moved to hardened shelters. This dispersal of assets is a standard procedure when an attack is considered a possibility, designed to minimize potential losses from a missile or airstrike. It was a clear sign that the Pentagon was taking the threat of an Iranian attack seriously long before the US launched its own strikes, preparing the fortress in the sand for a potential siege. The evacuation of aircraft and other precautions really underscore the delicate dance the US performs in the region. While projecting strength, it must also be acutely aware of its vulnerabilities. Al Udeid, for all its might, sits just a few hundred miles across the Persian Gulf from Iran, well within the range of Iran's growing arsenal of ballistic missiles. The base's very presence is both a symbol of American dominance and a potential flashpoint for conflict. The safety of the thousands of personnel stationed there is a paramount concern for any US president, as a successful attack with mass casualties would create immense political pressure for a massive and likely uncontrollable military response. Protecting Al-Udeid was therefore synonymous with preventing a wider war. When the Iranian missiles were finally launched, Al-Udeid was as ready as it could be. The advance warning from Iran, combined with the weeks of prior preparation, allowed the base's defense mechanisms to function exactly as designed. The personnel were secure in bunkers, the air defense systems were tracking the incoming threats, and the interceptors were ready to launch. The successful defense of the base was a testament to both the technological superiority of the US military and the strategic foresight of its commanders. The fortress held, and in doing so, it helped to contain a crisis that could have easily spiraled into a catastrophic regional conflict, proving its worth not just as a tool of war, but as an instrument for preserving a fragile peace. While missiles were flying, another quieter confrontation was playing out over one of the world's most critical economic choke points, the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway, separating Iran from the Arabian Peninsula, is the jugular vein of the global oil supply. Roughly 1/5 of the world's total oil consumption passes through this strait every day, making its security a matter of global concern. In the build-up of tensions, Iran's parliament made a provocative move, voting to authorize a blockade of the strait. This was Iran's most powerful non-military card, a threat to cripple the world economy in retaliation for any attack on its soil. The threat alone sent shudders through international markets and put global powers on edge. A blockade of the Strait of Hormuz would be a catastrophic event. It would immediately cause oil prices to skyrocket, potentially triggering a global recession. For this reason, keeping the strait open has been a cornerstone of US policy in the Middle East for decades. The United States Navy's Fifth Fleet, based in nearby Bahrain, has the primary mission of ensuring freedom of navigation through these vital waters. An Iranian attempt to close the strait would be seen as a direct act of war by the United States and its allies, guaranteeing a massive naval and air campaign to reopen it. The Iranian leadership knew this, making their threat a high-stakes bluff designed to deter aggression. Despite the parliamentary vote and the heated rhetoric, Iran ultimately chose not to play this card. The missiles were launched at a military base, but the oil tankers continued to sail through the strait unmolested. This decision was likely based on a cold, hard calculation of self-interest. While a blockade would hurt the West, it would also be devastating for Iran itself. Iran relies on the strait to export its own oil, and closing it would effectively sever its own economic lifeline. Furthermore, one of Iran's most important partners, China, is heavily dependent on the free flow of oil through the Gulf. Angering Beijing by shutting down its energy supply would be a strategic blunder of epic proportions. The fact that the Strait of Hormuz remained open throughout this intense crisis is perhaps one of the most telling indicators of Iran's true intentions. It showed that while Tehran was willing to engage in a symbolic and direct military exchange with the United States, it was not prepared to cross a red line that would invite overwhelming international condemnation and a devastating military response. The unplayed card of the Hormuz blockade served its purpose as a threat, adding another layer of tension to the standoff. But by leaving it on the table, Iran signaled that its goals were limited to a retaliatory show of force, not the ignition of a global economic and military catastrophe. Looking back at the whirlwind of events, the US strike, the Iranian retaliation, and the sudden ceasefire, it's hard to escape the conclusion that this was one of the most carefully choreographed military confrontations in recent memory. This was not a chaotic runaway escalation born of miscalculation and rage. Instead, it resembled a form of violent communication, a dialogue conducted with airstrikes and missiles where both sides took deliberate steps to control the narrative and manage the outcome. Each action was met with a response that was proportional and symbolic, designed to send a message rather than to inflict maximum damage. It was a deadly serious performance, but a performance nonetheless, played out on a global stage with the entire world as the audience. The first act of this performance was the American strike. It was precise, targeted, and aimed at military nuclear sites, not civilian populations. The message was one of capability and resolve, a demonstration of power meant to reset the rules of engagement. The second act was Iran's response. The Heralds of Conquest operation was a masterclass in calibrated retaliation. The matching number of missiles, the choice of a military target instead of a civilian one, and, most crucially, the advance warning. All of these elements were designed to create an equivalence. Iran was signaling that it had answered the attack and that honor had been satisfied, thereby creating an opportunity for both sides to step back without losing face. This careful choreography extended to the public statements made by both President Trump and the Iranian leadership. After the Iranian missiles were intercepted, President Trump didn't respond with threats of fire and fury. Instead, he thanked Iran for the warning and immediately pivoted to a message of peace. This rhetorical de-escalation was just as important as the military one. It gave Iran the political space it needed to accept the outcome without further action. Both sides seemed to understand that a full-blown war would be disastrous for everyone, and they navigated the crisis with a shared, unspoken goal to avoid that outcome at all costs. This strange, almost polite exchange of fire has been described by some security analysts as a new model for conflict management between nation-states in the nuclear and social media age. It was a conflict fought as much for public perception as for strategic advantage. Each side got to claim a victory of sorts. The US successfully damaged Iran's nuclear program and proved its defenses were impenetrable. Iran successfully demonstrated its defiance and its missile capabilities to a domestic audience. By carefully managing the escalation ladder and communicating intentions, both directly and indirectly, they averted a war that just days before had seemed all but inevitable. The choreography was risky and dangerous, but in the end, it worked. In the aftermath of the most intense 72 hours the Middle East has seen in years, an uneasy calm has settled over the region. The ceasefire announced by President Trump has held, and the war of words has been replaced by a cautious, watchful silence. For the first time in a long time, there is a tangible sense of relief, a feeling that a major catastrophe has been narrowly avoided. This episode, which brought the US and Iran to the very brink of war, is now being seen as a potential turning point. By pulling back from the edge, both sides may have inadvertently created a new, albeit fragile, foundation for de-escalation, and perhaps even future dialogue. The events have provided a unique opportunity for all parties to reassess their positions. For the United States, the successful defense of Al-Udeid and the lack of casualties provided a political victory without the need for a costly and unpredictable war. For Iran, the symbolic retaliation allowed the regime to save face and demonstrate its strength without inviting its own destruction. For Israel, the US strike on Iranian nuclear sites accomplished a long-standing strategic goal. This strange alignment of outcomes, where every side can claim some form of success, has created a rare moment of equilibrium. The question now is whether this equilibrium can be transformed into something more durable. Of course, the deep-seated issues that have fueled decades of animosity between Iran, Israel, and the United States have not disappeared. Distrust runs deep, and the fundamental conflicts over nuclear ambitions, regional influence, and political ideology remain. Skeptics rightly argue that this ceasefire could be nothing more than a temporary pause, a moment for both sides to rearm and plan their next moves. The path to a genuine, lasting peace is long and fraught with obstacles. It will require more than a carefully managed military standoff. It will require sustained and difficult diplomacy, a willingness to compromise, and a fundamental shift in strategic thinking from all sides. Yet for now, there is a glimmer of hope. This crisis demonstrated that even the most bitter of adversaries are capable of rational calculation and strategic restraint when faced with the prospect of mutually assured destruction. It proved that communication, even in its most unconventional forms, can work to prevent the worst outcomes. The world watched as the region stared into the abyss and chose to take a step back. What happens next is uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, The conversation in the Middle East is not about the inevitability of the next war, but about the possibility of preserving the peace. And that in itself is a profound and welcome change. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe for more updates.